The ship that carried them home wasn't a vessel of victory. It was gray, cold, and silent, a floating limbo between one world and another. The deck smelled of salt and diesel. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in worn coats and borrowed blankets, staring at the horizon as if trying to remember what it was supposed to look like. Germany. The word alone felt heavier than the sea beneath them. It had been months since the war's end. But no one on that ship spoke of it directly. They talked instead about small things, food, weather, dreams, anything but the truth waiting for them across the Atlantic. When the coastline finally appeared, it didn't look like home. The ports were shattered, cranes bent like broken arms, smoke still rising from somewhere far inland. The air smelled of ash and mud, the scent of a country rebuilding itself from ghosts. Liselott stood at the rail, her fingers gripping the cold metal, and realized she didn't feel joy or sorrow. Only a hollow, suspended quiet. The Americans processed them one last time before handing them over to the new German authorities. Papers were stamped, names checked, uniforms stripped for good. Each woman was given a ration card, a train ticket, and a number, their identities flattened to bureaucracy. When Liselott's turn came, the officer behind the desk glanced up. "Occupation?" he asked. She hesitated. Once she would have said radio operator. Once she would have said soldier. But both words felt false now, relics of a person who no longer existed. "Worker," she said finally. He nodded, uninterested, and stamped her file. The train ride inland was long and silent. The countryside rolled past in shades of brown and gray. Fields littered with wreckage, trees stripped bare, villages reduced to fragments of walls and chimneys. Every few miles they passed groups of people walking along the tracks, pushing carts piled with everything they owned. Refugees, scavengers, survivors. There was no longer a difference. When she reached her hometown, Liselott almost didn't recognize it. The station was half collapsed, the clock tower frozen at a time no one remembered. Children ran barefoot between piles of rubble, their laughter brittle and strange against the silence of the ruins. Her house was gone. The street where it once stood was a crater of broken brick and splintered beams. She found only the remnants of her mother's garden, a patch of scorched earth where wildflowers were starting to grow again. For a long time, she just stood there, the wind whipping through her hair, and tried to summon a feeling. Grief, anger, relief, and something. But there was nothing left to feel. A neighbor she barely recognized came out from the next street over. The woman was older now, thinner, her face lined with exhaustion. When she saw Liselott, she froze. "You came back," the woman said quietly, her tone unreadable. "Yes," Liselott replied. The silence between them was heavy. Finally, the woman asked, "From where?" "America," Liselott said. Something flickered across the woman's face, surprise, disbelief, maybe envy. "Then you were lucky." Liselott didn't answer. Lucky. The word landed like an accusation. That night she slept in what remained of the local schoolhouse, now turned into a makeshift shelter. The air smelled of smoke and chalk. People whispered around her, about ration lines, black markets, rumors of new governments. Everyone seemed to be talking about rebuilding, but no one knew what that meant. The next morning, she went to the town hall to register as a returning citizen. The official behind the counter asked routine questions in a voice drained of warmth. When he reached, "Where were you during the war?" She hesitated. "Texas," she said. His pen froze mid-stroke. "Texas?" "Yes, I was." "Prisoner?" The man raised his eyes slowly, studying her face. "Then you were with the Americans." She nodded. He didn't speak for a moment, then quietly said, "Some people won't like that." And he was right. In the weeks that followed, Liselott learned what it meant to be both survivor and suspect. To some, she was fortunate, one of the few who had food, work, and safety while others starved. To others, she was tainted, someone who'd lived too comfortably under the enemy's watch. The moral lines that had once defined everything were gone. Now, everyone lived in shades of gray, and no one trusted anyone else's story. She tried to find work, but jobs were scarce. Factories were rubble. The local farms could barely feed themselves. Eventually, she found a position in a postal office sorting mail, letters between families scattered across a continent trying to piece themselves back. together. Each envelope she handled felt like a ghost. Names written by trembling hands. Addresses that no longer existed. Sometimes she read the return labels and imagined the faces behind them. People waiting for answers that might never come. It was during one of those long, silent afternoons that she realized something strange. The discipline she'd learned as a prisoner, the patience, the quiet endurance, was the only thing keeping her sane now. Captivity had taught her how to survive. Freedom demanded she prove it. She wrote to her brother, using the address from his last letter. Weeks passed. Then one morning a reply arrived, shorter than before, written in a hurried scrawl. Alive, working near Dresden. Don't come. It's different now. No signature. Just that. She read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and tucked it into her coat. That night she walked outside to the edge of the ruins where her house had been. The moonlight glinted off the shattered bricks. And for the first time in months, she let herself cry. Not the sharp, panicked tears of fear, but slow, soundless ones that came from something deeper. She cried for the family she'd lost, for the country that no longer existed, for the person she had been before she understood how fragile beliefs could be. When she finally stopped, she realized she wasn't crying for the war. She was crying for peace, because peace, she was discovering, demanded more courage than battle ever had. In the following months, whispers began again, not of war this time, but of trials, reckonings, confessions. The newspapers printed stories of men and women being accused, judged, condemned. Some were guilty. Others were simply unlucky. Whenever Liselott walked through town, she felt eyes on her. The former uniform, the American captivity. They marked her like invisible scars. Some called her a collaborator. Others called her survivor. No one called her innocent. One afternoon, she overheard a woman in the market whisper, "She came back from America. They treated them well there, you know." Too well, Liselott turned away without a word. There was no defense she could offer that would make sense to them. How could she explain that the place they called enemy territory had been the only place she'd ever felt truly seen as human? The contradiction was too big for words. Sometimes, late at night, she would close her eyes and imagine the Texas ranch, the endless fields, the smell of rain on dust, the sound of Clover's hooves against the earth. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was memory, sharp and grounding, like a wound that refused to fade. She knew she couldn't return. But part of her still lived there, in that strange space between captivity and freedom, between guilt and grace. Years later, when people asked where she'd been during the war, she always answered carefully. In America, she would say, and if they pressed, she added only, "I learned what it means to survive." Most didn't ask further. Those who did never understood the truth, that survival had nothing to do with luck or mercy. It had everything to do with learning to live without certainty, to accept that the enemy could be kind. And that kindness could be the hardest thing to bear. Germany rebuilt itself slowly, brick by brick, but Liselott never truly rebuilt herself. She became part of the silence that settled over the country in those years. The silence of those who had seen too much to believe in clear answers anymore. And yet, sometimes when the wind shifted and carried the faint scent of hay and rain through the open window, she would pause, close her eyes, and almost hear it again. The echo of horses in the distance. The laughter of people who were supposed to be enemies but had, for a brief, impossible moment, shared the same sky. In that sound, fleeting and fragile, was the truth she'd carried home from captivity, that humanity doesn't belong to nations. It belongs to moments, small, unguarded, defiant, that survive even when everything else burns away. It began, as most things did on the ranch, with a whisper. Someone had overheard a guard talking to the rancher, and by nightfall, the rumor had spread through the bunkhouse like wind through dry grass. The war was ending. The prisoners would soon be released. No one knew when or how. Some said the Americans would send them back by train. Others claimed they'd be kept until formal surrender documents were signed. A few, the hopeful ones, swore that they'd be free within weeks. For the first time in years, the word home returned to their conversations. At first it was spoken quietly, cautiously, as if saying it too loudly might break the fragile possibility of it coming true. But soon it grew louder, spilling into mealtime chatter and late-night whispers. Home. It was supposed to be a beautiful word. But for Lieselot Minhart, it was the most complicated word she'd ever known. Each time she heard it, something inside her clenched. Not from excitement, but from fear. Because what was home now? The Germany she had left no longer existed. The cities were rubble, the streets unrecognizable. Her family may be gone. The ideology that once defined her life, discredited, defeated, drowned beneath the weight of its own destruction. Going home didn't mean returning to something familiar. It meant walking into the unknown. The others tried to fill the silence with optimism. They talked about the food they missed, the clothes they would wear again, the songs that would finally sound right when sung in their own language. But Lieselot stayed quiet. She smiled when they looked at her, nodded at the right times. But inside she felt nothing but vertigo. The idea of freedom frightened her more than captivity ever had. In captivity, everything was clear but who you were, what you could do, what you couldn't. There were rules, fences, routines. But freedom meant choices, and choices meant responsibility. And that, after everything, felt heavier than the chains she couldn't see. Still, the air on the ranch changed as the rumors grew. The guards seemed more relaxed, the rancher quieter. Even the horses sensed it, restless, snorting more often, stamping at the dirt. The entire world felt like it was holding its breath. One afternoon, a supply truck arrived carrying newspapers. The translator handed one to Lieselot. The headline was short, simple, final. Germany surrenders. She read the words again and again until they stopped making sense. The war, the all-consuming identity-defining force of her existence, was over. For hours, she said nothing. The other women wept, some with relief, others with shame. A few even laughed hysterically, unable to process what the end truly meant. That night, the bunkhouse felt different, heavier. The silence was thick with thoughts no one dared to voice. When the lights went out, Lieselot lay awake, staring at the faint outlines of the rafters above her bed. The question repeated in her head like a clock ticking in an empty room. If I am no longer a soldier, no longer a prisoner, then what am I? The next morning, the rancher confirmed what everyone already knew. The war's over, he said simply. You'll all be processed soon, sent home when it's time. Cheers erupted around her. But Lieselot couldn't move. The words sent home didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like a sentence. The following days blurred together in strange, uneven ways. The work continued. Fences still needed mending, animals still needed feeding. But the energy was different. Everything felt temporary, like a play running through its final act. The guards began to smile more. They let the women linger outside after dusk, even play cards with the ranch hands. Some of the women started to dream aloud about staying, half joking, half serious. Maybe I'll marry a rancher, one of them said, laughing. And for a moment the idea didn't sound impossible. But Lieselot knew better. The war had ended, but the world hadn't forgotten. The lines between victor and vanquished were too deep, too raw. Still, she couldn't stop herself from imagining it, what it would mean to remain here, in the country that had shown her both captivity and kindness. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the air filled with the sound of crickets, she walked to the corral where Clover grazed. Tom was there, leaning against the fence, watching the horizon. So, he said without turning. You're going home soon, she nodded. That's what they say. He kicked at the dirt. You happy about that? She hesitated. I should be. But you're not. No. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no right way to explain what she felt. Gratitude and guilt tangled together inside her. Impossible to separate. Finally she said, It's strange. I came here as the enemy, and now, I don't know what that means anymore. Tom smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held more sadness than joy. Maybe that's the point. They stood in silence after that, both staring at the endless Texas horizon. It was beautiful, but also brutal. A reminder that the world didn't stop for anyone's confusion. The next morning, orders came from the army. The prisoners would be transferred to a processing facility within the week. After that, repatriation. When the announcement came, the women packed in silence. The sound of folding clothes, the creak of old suitcases, the scraping of boots on wood. It all felt surreal. Each item packed away was a piece of a life they'd borrowed and now had to return. The rancher came to say goodbye. He shook their hands one by one. When he reached Liselot, he paused. "You did good work here," he said softly. "I hope you remember that." She nodded, unable to speak. As they climbed into the transport truck, she turned to look back at the ranch, the white fences glowing in the morning sun. The fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon looked the same as the day she'd arrived, yet everything had changed. The engine rumbled to life. The dust rose behind them as the ranch disappeared from view. No one spoke for the first few miles. The air inside the truck was heavy with memory. The women stared out at the open plains, each lost in her own thoughts. Liselot watched the land roll past, the dry earth, the scattered trees, the distant silhouettes of ranch houses. For the first time, she realized that she didn't know how to be herself outside this place. In captivity, she had discovered pieces of her humanity she hadn't known existed. What would happen to them now, once she was thrown back into a country broken beyond recognition? That question haunted her more than any enemy ever had. At a rest stop, one of the guards passed her a canteen of water. "You'll be free soon," he said kindly. She looked at him, the sun reflecting off his badge, and managed a small smile. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe freedom isn't what I thought it was." He frowned, confused, but didn't press her. When the truck finally reached the edge of the next camp, a proper military facility surrounded by barbed wire, Liselot felt a strange wave of nostalgia. The fences, the guards, the order of it all. It was the world she understood best, and yet as the gates closed behind them, she felt the crushing weight of loss. Not for Germany, not for the past, but for something unexpected, for the quiet, dusty ranch where she had learned for the first time what it meant to see the humanity in her captors, and in herself. That night, lying on a thin cot beneath a metal roof, she thought of Clover, of Tom, of the rancher's weathered hands and the endless Texas sky. She thought of her brother's letter, of his warning not to change, and she realized something he never could have understood. That change wasn't a betrayal. It was survival. The war had ended, but her battle was just beginning. The fight to carry the lessons of captivity into a world that still believed in enemies. She turned on her side, staring at the faint moonlight spilling through the cracks in the ceiling. Somewhere beyond those walls, the ranch wind still blew across the plains, and for the first time since the war began, Liselot let herself hope, not for victory, not for redemption, but simply for a life where being human was enough. The war had always been black and white in Liselot's mind. Victory and defeat, loyalty and betrayal, right and wrong. But by the time autumn arrived in Texas, the edges of that certainty had worn thin. The air grew cooler, softer, and the long days of summer work gave way to quieter evenings. The ranch's pace slowed, but Liselot's thoughts never did. Something inside her was changing, and she couldn't stop it. It began with a letter. The Red Cross had finally managed to deliver a batch of mail from overseas, fragile envelopes yellowed with dust and time. When the translator called her name, she didn't move at first. It had been so long since she'd seen her own handwriting on an envelope that the sight of it felt foreign. The letter was from her older brother, Friedrich. The handwriting was rushed, the ink faint. He was somewhere in what was left of Eastern Germany, working with refugees and remnants of the military. His words were clipped, cautious. He wrote about the hunger, the fear, the silence that had fallen over entire cities. He didn't mention their parents. He didn't have to. Near the end, one sentence stood out sharp and heavy. "Whatever you do, don't forget who you are. Don't let them change you." Liselot read that line over and over until the letters blurred. Don't let them change you. But wasn't that already happening? Every day she spent among her captors, among people who spoke gently, who shared food, who treated her with a level of dignity she hadn't expected, eroded the certainty that had once kept her strong. She folded the letter and hid it under her mattress, but she couldn't hide from the question it left behind. Was she still the same person who had worn that uniform with pride? The collision of identities wasn't loud or violent. It was subtle, constant, exhausting. When she first arrived at the ranch, being German had meant something fixed and unshakable. It was a badge of discipline, order, pride. But here the meaning twisted. The word German didn't inspire fear or authority. It inspired curiosity, sometimes pity, sometimes quiet resentment. She'd overheard the townspeople talking when they came to trade supplies. "They're not like the others," one woman had said. "They work hard, they're polite. You'd never know they were the enemy." The enemy, Lieselotte hated that word, not because of what it meant to them, but because of what it revealed about her. To the Americans, she was a symbol of the war that had taken their sons. To herself, she was beginning to feel like a stranger wearing someone else's guilt. It came to a head one afternoon when she found herself arguing, really arguing, with Tom, the ranch hand who'd once helped her during the storm. They'd been repairing a section of fencing near the main road when a military truck passed by. The men inside shouted something crude in English, and Lieselotte caught only fragments, enough to understand it was about her. Tom shouted back at them to shut up, but she could see the anger in his face wasn't for them. It was for her reaction. Later, when they were alone, she asked him, "Why did you defend me?" He shrugged. "Because it wasn't right. You don't even know me," she said sharply. "You don't know what I've done." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Don't need to. I see who you are now." The words hit harder than she expected. Now. The implication was simple. She wasn't who she had been. That night, she couldn't sleep. The bunkhouse was silent except for the creak of wood and the faint hum of insects outside. She lay awake, replaying the conversation in her mind, trying to decide whether she should feel grateful or ashamed. Could a person really change that much just because they were treated differently? Or had the version of herself she'd built during the war been the illusion all along? The questions gnawed at her, especially when new prisoners arrived from other camps. They brought stories, grim ones, of places where Americans weren't so kind, camps where food was scarce, where the guards took their anger out on the prisoners, where punishment was still a tool of control. Lieselotte couldn't reconcile those stories with the world she knew. It made her wonder if decency, like cruelty, depended on circumstance, on who was watching, on what was convenient. Still, there was one truth she couldn't deny. Compassion had power. It didn't just soften her. It confused her. It forced her to think. And that, she realized, was its most dangerous effect. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned gold, she walked with the rancher along the fence line. He was an older man, with weathered skin and a calmness that seemed impossible in a world torn apart by war. "You've done good work," he said quietly. "Your girls too. I'll make sure the army knows that when they come through again." "Thank you," she said, uncertain how to respond. He glanced at her. "You know, I fought in the last war," he said after a pause. "France, 1918. Thought I'd seen the end of all this." She looked at him, surprised. "And now you take care of your enemies." He gave a small, dry laugh. "Enemies? Maybe once. Now you're just people trying to get home." His words settled into her chest like stones. Just people trying to get home. It was such a simple phrase. Yet it dismantled everything she'd been told to believe. That the war was about destiny. That one nation's will mattered more than another's humanity. That night, she stood outside and stared up at the sky. The stars in Texas were so vast they made her dizzy. Somewhere far beyond them, her brother was still fighting to hold on to what little was left of home. Somewhere, soldiers she'd once saluted were still dying for, ideas that suddenly felt thin and breakable. And here she was, a prisoner being shown more humanity by her captors than she had ever been allowed to show. Her own people. The contradiction was unbearable. The next morning, she woke before dawn and went to the stables. Clover nickered softly when she entered, her breath misting in the cold. Lieselotte brushed the mare's coat in silence, her mind a storm of guilt and confusion. At some point, she whispered, "They say we lost the war." But maybe it was lost long before that. Her voice trembled. But it was the first time she'd said the thought aloud. The first time she'd allowed herself to believe it. The war had taken everything that made sense and replaced it with survival. It had stripped people down to obedience, to fear. But here in captivity, stripped of her flag, her rank, her cause, Lieselotte was beginning to rebuild something else. something painfully human. In the evenings, when the guards relaxed and the radio played American songs about home and love, she caught herself humming along. She didn't understand all the words, but the emotion was universal. Longing, loss, hope. One night, the translator caught her listening and smiled. "You like that one?" She hesitated. "It sounds honest," he nodded. "That's Hank Williams. He sings what people feel. Even enemies?" she asked quietly. "Especially enemies," he said. Liselott didn't answer, but she carried that line with her for weeks, because the truth was unavoidable. The longer she lived among them, the more she saw herself reflected in the people she'd been taught to despise. The cultural divide that had once seemed so wide was shrinking, inch by inch, replaced by the quiet realization that morality wasn't a matter of borders or uniforms. It was a matter of choice, and the hardest part was realizing how easily she could have made the wrong one. When the first frost came, the ranch fields turned pale silver in the mornings. The air was cold enough to sting, but Liselott no longer shivered from it. She had grown used to the rhythms of this new life, but not numb to its contradictions. She was a prisoner, yes, but in some strange, twisted way. She was freer here than she had ever been before, and that was the greatest collision of all, to realize that freedom and captivity could exist in the same place, in the same body, in the same heart. The Texas sun was merciless. By midsummer, it burned the horizon into a pale, trembling haze, and even the wind seemed tired. Dust clung to everything, the horses' manes, the wooden fences, the sleeves of the women's uniforms. But somehow, life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Every morning began before dawn. The sky would still be deep blue, almost black, when Liselott stepped outside the bunkhouse, her boots crunching against dry soil. The air was cool at that hour, carrying the faint smell of dew and livestock. It was the only time of day when the land felt soft, when the heat hadn't yet woken up. The women moved like ghosts in the early light, their whispers low, their faces half hidden by scarves to block the dust. They'd long stopped walking in tight military lines the way they had when they first arrived. Now their pace was slower, more human. Work began before the sun reached the horizon. Horses were led from the stables, cattle driven toward the lower fields, water hauled in great metal buckets from the well. The rancher's voice cut through the morning air, steady and calm as he gave out tasks. He never raised it in anger, not once. That fact still surprised Liselott. In the beginning, she had watched him with suspicion, convinced the kindness was just a layer of paint over something darker. But as the weeks turned into months, her certainty began to dissolve. He treated everyone the same. Americans, Germans, even the ranch hands from Mexico who worked the nearby fields. To him, work was work, and respect was earned, not gifted. Liselotte had never known authority that gentle before. She spent most of her days with the horses now. The rancher had noticed how they calmed under her touch, even the skittish ones that refused to be saddled by the others. There was one in particular, a gray mare named Clover, that seemed to mirror her moods. When Liselott was tense, Clover tossed her head. When she was calm, the mare's breathing slowed. That bond became her anchor. In a world turned upside down by war, it was the only relationship that felt safe to trust. As the summer deepened, the days grew longer, and the small boundaries between prisoner and ranch hand started to blur. The guards no longer shadowed every move. Some even joked with the women in broken German, trading words and laughter like small acts of rebellion against the idea of war itself. At first, Liselott tried not to join in. She told herself it wasn't right, that every laugh, every shared moment was a kind of betrayal. But the wall inside her had already started to crack. One afternoon, while helping mend a broken gate, she caught herself humming a tune from her childhood. A lullaby her mother used to sing. One of the ranch hands, a man named Tom, looked up from his work and smiled. "Pretty song," he said in English. She froze, embarrassed. "German," she replied. "Still pretty," he answered, and went back to hammering nails. It was such a simple exchange, but it lingered with her the entire evening. There had been no suspicion, no mockery, just a moment of shared quiet. Two people working under the same sky, neither enemy nor friend, but something in between. That in-between became the new reality of the ranch. The women learned bits of English from the guards and the cook. The Americans picked up pieces of German. Mealtimes grew less tense. There were still rules, strict curfews, head counts, constant reminders that they were prisoners. But the atmosphere was lighter now, almost fragile in its normalcy. Sometimes, when the work was done and the air finally cooled, Liselott and a few of the others would sit on the bunkhouse steps, watching the last light fade behind the hills. The sky in Texas didn't fade quietly. It exploded into streaks of pink and red before giving way to indigo. They would talk in low voices about home, about the families they hadn't heard from in years, about what might be left of their towns. "I can't imagine it anymore," one of the women said one night, her eyes fixed on the stars. "The sound of trains, of cities. It feels like another life." Liselott nodded. "Maybe it is." She didn't say what she was really thinking, that this strange, faraway ranch had become more real to her than the Europe she'd left behind. Still, the unease never fully disappeared. There were moments when the illusion of peace shattered, a reminder that, however gentle the captivity, it was captivity all the same. Once, a truck arrived carrying a new group of prisoners from a nearby camp. They were men, thin and hollow-eyed, and the soldiers who escorted them were less patient than the ones at the ranch. The sight of rifles, the clipped tone of orders, the nervous energy in the air, it brought everything rushing back. That night the bunkhouse felt smaller, suffocating. Liselott lay awake, clutching her thin blanket, trying to silence the thought that whispered in her mind, "Don't forget where you are." But forgetting was easy. Too easy, because the next morning the sun came up again. The horses whinnied for feed and the rhythm resumed. Life didn't stop for fear. It just carried on, quietly defiant. The shift within her wasn't loud or sudden. It crept in slowly like a change in the wind. She began to think less in terms of sides, us and them, and more in terms of people. The Americans weren't the monsters she'd imagined. Some were cruel in small, casual ways. Others were thoughtful, even kind. They were human, flawed, inconsistent, but human. And once she accepted that, she couldn't look at the world the same way again. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds boiling across the plains. The air turned electric, the horses restless. The rancher shouted for everyone to move fast, to bring the herd in before the rain hit. Liselott and the others ran through mud and wind, ropes in their hands, trying to corral the animals as thunder cracked overhead. At some point, the sky split open and the rain came down in sheets. The world blurred into chaos, hooves pounding, lightning flashing, the smell of wet earth everywhere. Liselott lost her footing and fell hard, her hands scraping against the ground. For a moment, she expected to hear a command barked at her, a threat, an order. But instead, someone reached down and pulled her up. It was Tom, the ranch hand, soaked muddy, grinning. "You all right?" He shouted over the storm. She nodded, out of breath. He pointed toward the corral, laughing. "Then move. They're faster than you." And just like that, in the middle of chaos, she laughed too, loud, unguarded, the sound carried away by the wind. When the storm finally passed, the herd was safe, the fields drenched and the sky glowing again with faint gold. The rancher clapped the women on the shoulders one by one, saying nothing, but offering a small nod of respect. It was the closest thing to equality they'd ever felt. That night, the air smelled of wet grass and smoke from the cook fire. Someone inside the main house played a radio softly, a country tune that floated through the open windows. The war felt impossibly far away, like a bad dream fading in the morning light. Sitting by the corral, Liselott ran her fingers through Clover's mane and felt the quiet pulse of life beneath the horse's skin. It was strange. The same land that had once terrified her now felt like sanctuary, but she knew it couldn't last. Every kindness here existed in the shadow of something larger, something temporary. When the war ended, everything would change. She would be sent back across the ocean, back to a country she no longer recognized, back to a version of herself that might no longer exist. Still, for now, in that fragile moment between war and peace, between enemy and friend, Liselott allowed herself to breathe, to exist not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, but simply as a person. The ranch had become something unexpected, not a prison, but a mirror, and every time she looked into it, she saw less of the uniform and more of the woman beneath it, the one she'd nearly forgotten existed. The days that followed blurred together, a rhythm of dust, heat, and the steady creak of saddle leather. The ranch ran like clockwork, but it didn't feel like a prison. There were guards, yes, and fences that marked the edges of the property, but no barbed wire, no shouting, no sense of immediate danger. To Liselot, that alone was unsettling. Captivity wasn't supposed to feel this calm. Each morning began with the same ritual. The women rose at dawn, ate a sparse breakfast of bread and black coffee, and stepped out into the glowing light that always seemed to linger longer in Texas. The air was cool at first, almost gentle, before the sun climbed and turned everything white with heat. They fed animals, cleaned stalls, and hauled hay bales heavy enough to leave their hands raw. It was hard work, backbreaking at times, but it carried a strange kind of dignity. The rancher treated them not as prisoners, but as laborers, even employees. There were rules, but no cruelty. Orders, but no violence. It was a quiet, almost invisible form of control, one that didn't rely on fear, but on structure and respect. And that was the first sign of something Liselot couldn't quite name, a philosophy that seemed to shape everything around her. At night, when the stars stretched across the black sky like spilled salt, the translator, a young man from Nebraska, explained it to them. "The U.S. has rules," he said, sitting on a wooden crate outside the bunkhouse, his accent soft but sure. "You're prisoners, yes, but under the Geneva Convention, that means you still have rights." The women looked at him blankly. Rights? The word felt absurd. In war, rights were the first things that disappeared. He continued, "You're paid for your labor. You get food, medical care, shelter. No one here is allowed to mistreat you. If they do, they answer for it," Liselot almost laughed. "And you expect us to believe that?" She said quietly. He shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." And they did, slowly. Over the weeks that followed, the ranch revealed itself as part of something larger. A network of camps scattered across Texas and the American South. Tens of thousands of German POWs were housed there, working in cotton fields, orchards, and farms. They built irrigation systems, harvested crops, repaired roads. They were paid in credits, not cash, enough to buy small comforts like soap, tobacco, or stationery. Rumors circulated that even in the camps closer to cities, life wasn't brutal. No forced starvation, no beatings. It was all so civilized. One afternoon, while repairing a broken fence, Liselot overheard two guards talking. They didn't know she understood a bit of English, but the tone was easy to read. "Never thought I'd be looking after Germans on a horse ranch," one of them said with a laugh. "Heck, they work harder than half the boys back home." The other replied, "Yeah, boss says treat 'em right, they'll return the favor. Keeps the peace. Don't need trouble out here, treat them right." The phrase stuck with her. It wasn't kindness for kindness' sake, it was practical, efficient, but it worked. The prisoners behaved, the work got done, and the community nearby didn't complain. Over time, the line between captor and captive began to blur, not in law, but in daily life. There was even a rumor, whispered late at night when the guards were out of earshot, that some of the male prisoners in nearby camps had been allowed into town to buy supplies, sometimes even to attend church. The thought sounded impossible, like propaganda in reverse. But the more Liselot saw, the less impossible it seemed. She noticed other things too, small gestures that carried more meaning than words. The rancher's wife, a quiet woman with kind eyes, occasionally brought extra bread from the kitchen and left it by the door of the bunkhouse without a word. Once, when one of the women cut her hand on a rusted nail, the foreman drove her to a nearby clinic himself. No threats, no shouting, just help given freely. It made Liselot's chest ache in a way she didn't understand. One night, she sat outside alone, watching the flickering oil lamps in the main house. The air smelled of rain, a rare thing in that part of Texas, and she could hear faint laughter drifting from inside. The Americans were celebrating something, maybe a holiday. She listened to the hum of voices, the clinking of glasses, and realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the sound of celebration. She thought of Germany, of bomb shelters, ration cards, endless speeches about victory while cities turned to ash. And here the enemy sat around a table singing softly. It was disorienting. But the more she learned, the more she saw the method behind it. The Americans weren't trying to humiliate them. They were trying to prove a point, maybe even make an example. To show the world and the prisoners themselves that civilization didn't have to vanish in wartime. That power could exist without cruelty. Still, not everyone believed in that message. Some of the women remained defiant, whispering that it was all an illusion, a trick meant to make them weak. Others refused to speak English, refused to engage, clinging to their uniforms and their pride like armor. But resistance had nowhere to grow on open plains. Every sunrise erased a little more of it. There was a saying that spread quietly among the prisoners, one that started as sarcasm and became something else. The Americans fight with kindness. Lieselot never said it aloud, but she felt it. Every day chipped away at the image she'd been taught to believe, that Americans were ruthless, arrogant, animalistic. Instead, she found something confusing: decency. Imperfect, sometimes patronizing, but real. Once she asked the translator why they treated Germans so well. He hesitated before answering. "Because we can," he said simply. "Because if we don't, we become what we're fighting." That answer lingered in her mind long after he walked away. The next morning, a delivery truck arrived at the ranch bringing supplies, sacks of feed, a crate of canned goods, and a stack of newspapers. The papers were old, yellowed from the sun, but the headlines hit like thunder. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Paris liberated. The war turning against Germany. The women read in silence, eyes darting across the foreign words, trying to make sense of the disaster. Some cried quietly. Others stared blankly at the ground. For Lieselot, the news was a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that maybe, somehow, the war would end. Dread for what would be left when it did. She folded the paper carefully, as though it might crumble in her hands. That night, she dreamed of radio static, the old hum of transmissions she once sent across occupied Europe. Voices, orders, codes. But this time, the signal faded into something softer, the distant sound of horses, wind, and laughter. When she woke, the world outside was still. Dawn was breaking again, the same gold light spilling across the fields. The war, at least for her, felt far away, reduced to headlines and rumors. And yet deep down she knew the truth. This calm was temporary. The war would find them again eventually, in one form or another. But until then, she had a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to work, to breathe, to think. The freedom to question everything she'd once believed. Because on that Texas ranch, among people she'd been taught to hate, Lieselot Minhart was beginning to understand something dangerous, that humanity didn't belong to one side of the war. It existed quietly, stubbornly, even here, in the heart of the enemy's land. And once you saw that truth, you couldn't unsee. The sun climbed higher that morning, spilling light over the wide Texas plains like liquid gold. Heat shimmered off the dirt, and somewhere in the distance a windmill creaked with each slow turn. The ranch seemed almost too calm, the kind of quiet that didn't fit the image of war or of captives, or of enemies at all. Lieselot and the others were led toward the corral where the horses waited. The animals were massive, their muscles shifting beneath smooth coats, their dark eyes watching the women with a mix of curiosity and calm. The smell of hay and leather filled the air, warm and almost comforting. For a moment, Lieselot forgot that she was a prisoner. Then the sound of boots crunching over gravel snapped her back to reality. An American soldier, young, maybe 20 at most, approached with a clipboard in hand. He wasn't armed, or at least he didn't look ready to use his weapon. His posture was loose, casual, even polite. When he spoke, his tone wasn't harsh, just matter-of-fact. "You'll be split into groups," the translator said, repeating the instructions in German. "Some will work in the kitchen, others in the fields. A few of you with horses, if you can handle them." The women exchanged uneasy glances. The word horses sounded strange in this setting. Back home, work meant factories, uniforms, endless shifts under the watch of soldiers who never smiled. Here, the idea of touching an animal, of being trusted with one, seemed like an absurd joke. Lieselot's group was assigned to the corral. She could feel the weight of eyes on her. both the Americans watching for any sign of disobedience, and the Germans behind her, suspicious of what might happen next. She wasn't sure which gaze was harder to bear. The rancher, the same man who had spoken to her the day before, appeared again. He was older, probably in his 50s, his face lined by sun and time. His hat shaded his eyes, but the way he carried himself radiated quiet authority. He didn't bark orders. He gave instructions the way a teacher might. Feed him, brush him down, keep him calm, he said. His voice steady, patient. The translator struggled to keep up with his slow drawl. They spook easy if you move too fast. The women hesitated, unsure how close they were allowed to go. Then the rancher nodded to Liselot. You first, he said simply. Her stomach twisted. Every instinct told her this was a test and maybe even a trap. But the horse's eyes weren't threatening. They were deep brown and still. Slowly she reached out her hand. The horse snorted, lowering its head slightly as if giving permission. When her fingers brushed its nose, she felt warmth and breath. Real, solid, alive. A strange feeling washed over her, not fear, not defiance, but something quieter, something like peace. The rancher smiled. Not bad, he said almost to himself. Then to the translator, she's got a calm hand. Keep her on the horses. For the rest of that morning, Liselot worked alongside 2 other women, cleaning the stables, hauling water, brushing the animals. Sweat soaked through her uniform, dust stuck to her skin, and yet, she didn't mind. The work felt grounding, almost humanizing. Every so often, she'd glance toward the men nearby, waiting for the shouting to start, for someone to strike out, to remind them who they were. But it never came. Instead, the guards talked quietly among themselves, joking, passing around a canteen. When they looked toward the women, their expressions weren't cruel, just curious, as if trying to figure out how these foreign faces fit into their world. Around midday, a bell rang from somewhere near the main house. Lunch. The women were guided to a long wooden table set beneath a shade tree. Tin plates were handed out, each with a small portion of beans, bread, and slices of salted meat. It wasn't generous, but it was food. Real food. Liselot sat at the end of the table, her appetite fighting with her suspicion. The others ate cautiously, glancing around as if expecting the meal to be snatched away. When one of the soldiers passed by with a jug of water and refilled their cups without saying a word, the quiet grew heavier. This is strange, one of the women whispered. Too kind. It's not supposed to be this way. Liselot didn't answer. She didn't know what to think. She just stared at the horizon, wide, endless, and blindingly bright. Back home, the war had closed in from every direction. Here it was open, space everywhere. No sirens, no explosions, just wind moving through dry grass. For the first time, she could hear her own thoughts clearly. And that terrified her. When work resumed in the afternoon, the rancher approached again, this time carrying a small leather saddle. Ever ridden before? He asked through the translator. Liselot hesitated, then nodded. He gestured toward a brown mare tied near the fence. Try her, he said. Gentle one. Won't throw you. The other women froze, eyes wide. A prisoner riding a horse? That couldn't be right. But the rancher's tone left no room for argument. Liselot swallowed hard, heart racing. She moved closer to the mare, checking the straps like muscle memory guiding her hands. When she swung her leg over and settled into the saddle, a ripple of disbelief moved through the small group watching. The rancher stepped back, arms crossed. Go on, he said quietly. Liselot gave a cautious nudge with her heel, and the horse began to walk. The rhythm was steady, familiar, almost soothing. She rode a slow circle inside the corral, the air thick with dust and sun. For the briefest moment, it didn't matter who she was. Soldier, prisoner, stranger. She was just a woman on a horse moving through light. When she stopped and dismounted, the rancher gave her a nod. Not approval exactly, but something close. Told you she'd like it here, he murmured. That night, as the women sat together in the bunkhouse, their hands raw from work, they whispered about the day in disbelief. The Americans had fed them, let them ride. Spoke to them without hatred. None of it matched the stories they'd been told back in Germany. One woman, older and bitter, shook her head. It's manipulation, she insisted. They want to soften us, make us forget who we are. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was strategy. a psychological trick meant to break their pride. But Liselot wasn't sure. When she thought back to the horse's steady breath, the smell of hay, the sound of laughter drifting from the ranch house, she couldn't reconcile it with the idea of cruelty. Lying awake later, she studied the wooden ceiling again, tracing the cracks with her eyes. The air was thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something sweet, maybe pie baking somewhere nearby. She almost smiled at the absurdity of it, the enemy baking pie while she lay in captivity. Still, one thought wouldn't leave her. If this was what the enemy looked like, what else had she been wrong about? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof, making the world feel unsteady again. She closed her eyes, clutching her thin blanket tighter. Tomorrow would bring more work, more questions, more small moments that didn't fit into the story she'd believed for so long. And deep down, beneath the layers of fear and confusion, a quiet curiosity began to form. A dangerous kind of curiosity. Because for the first time, Liselot wasn't just surviving. She was starting to see, and what she saw didn't match the war she thought she understood. The sky over Texas was the color of dust, that muted gold that turns everything it touches into memory. It was 1944, the middle of a war that stretched across oceans, and a convoy of army trucks rumbled down a dirt road just outside Amarillo. Inside one of them sat a group of German women, their faces pale, silent, pressed close together as if the air itself could not be trusted. The smell was what hit them first. Dry earth, sweat, and the faint sweetness of hay carried in from somewhere nearby. For days they'd been sealed in those trucks, guarded, watched, transported across a country they didn't understand. Every jolt of the road rattled their nerves. None of them knew exactly where they were going. The only certainty was that this wasn't home, and it wasn't freedom. Among them sat a young woman named Liselot Minhart. She had been a radio operator for the Luftwaffe, proud once, terrified now. Just months earlier, she'd been stationed in occupied France, sending coded messages under the crackle of static. When the Allies pushed through, her unit was captured almost overnight. The men were separated. The women marched to holding camps, then loaded onto ships bound for America. That word, America, carried an almost mythical weight back in Germany. To them, it meant the enemy, the land of excess and cruelty, a place where prisoners vanished and never came back. That's what they'd been told. Liselot believed it. She had to. It was easier than imagining anything else. The truck lurched, grinding to a stop. Dust swirled through the open slats in the wood. A voice barked orders in English, sharp, unfamiliar. The back doors swung open and sunlight poured in like a blade. The women flinched. A few shielded their eyes, bracing for shouts, for rifles, for the kind of humiliation they'd been warned about. But what they saw instead didn't make sense. Beyond the truck was no prison yard, no fences topped with wire, no rows of guard towers slicing into the sky, just open land and a stretch of tan prairie that went on forever. A small ranch house stood in the distance, its tin roof flashing in the sun. Horses grazed lazily near a wooden fence. A few men in wide-brimmed hats waited nearby, sleeves rolled up, relaxed. One of them leaned against a fence post, chewing on a piece of straw like he had nowhere better to be. Liselot blinked, her heart pounding. Was this a trick? The soldiers gestured for them to step down. Boots hit the dirt one after another. The air was hot, dry, and heavy with the scent of grass and sun-baked wood. The American guards, not shouting, not sneering, simply guided them toward the shade. One of them handed out tin cups filled with water. Real cold water, the kind that burned a little going down after days of nothing but the metallic taste of ration tins. Liselot hesitated before taking hers. It felt wrong to accept something from the enemy. But thirst won the argument. She drank, and in that moment something in her mind shifted, just slightly. There were no chains. No cages, no beatings. Just quiet observation. Still, she couldn't relax. She remembered every story she'd heard before being captured. How Allied soldiers mistreated prisoners. How women disappeared. How no one ever saw them again. The fear ran deep, coiled tight in her chest like barbed wire. Then came the words she least expected to hear. One of the men, older, maybe the foreman or owner, stepped forward and spoke through a translator. He told them this wasn't a military camp. Not in the way they imagined. This was a ranch. They'd be staying here to work, help with chores, take care of animals. In exchange, they'd have food, shelter, and wages, a small allowance under the Geneva Convention. Lieselot didn't believe it. It sounded like a trick, a lie dressed up in kindness. But the translator insisted. "You're here to work, not to suffer," he said. "You'll be treated fairly. Just do your part." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then one of the German women laughed, not out of amusement, but disbelief. It was the brittle, nervous kind of laugh that hides panic. Another whispered, "They're toying with us." Lieselot said nothing. She watched the men lead a pair of horses toward the corral. The animals were huge, their coats shimmering in the heat, their breath rising in soft clouds. One horse tossed its head, flicking its mane, and the sight pulled something from deep inside her, a memory of her childhood home before the war, before the noise and hunger, when she'd dreamed of open fields and freedom. The foreman noticed her staring. "You ride?" he asked the translator, nodding toward Lieselot. She blinked, startled. "A little," she replied quietly, though she hadn't sat on a horse in years. He smiled faintly and said something she didn't yet understand, but would remember for the rest of her life. "Then maybe you'll like it here." That line haunted her the entire first night. They slept in a bunkhouse. Rows of narrow beds lined up beneath a roof that creaked whenever the wind picked up. It wasn't a cell, but it felt like one all the same. The walls were wood instead of concrete, but the weight of captivity didn't fade easily. Lieselot lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Texas night. Crickets. Wind, the distant low of cattle. Back in Germany, the nights had been filled with the drone of aircraft, the whistle of sirens, the dull roar of distant bombs. Here, the silence was almost unbearable. She wondered what the Americans wanted from them. What kind of war was this, where the enemy was handed water, beds, even the company of animals? Nothing about it fit what she'd been taught. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Before dawn, a guard's footsteps crunched outside. The door creaked open and a calm voice called them to wake. "Work starts early here," the translator announced. "The rancher wants you to meet the horses." Horses again. Lieselot sat up, brushing the dust from her uniform. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear of punishment, but from the strangeness of it all. In her mind, she replayed the image of the open fields, the endless sky, the men who didn't raise their voices. It was impossible not to wonder. What kind of captivity was this? As the first light of morning stretched over the horizon, painting the plains gold, Lieselot stepped outside. The air was cool, the world quiet except for the rhythmic clatter of hooves somewhere beyond the fence. She stood there for a long moment, caught between two worlds, the one she came from, built on fear and propaganda, and this new one, wide open and unexplainably gentle. She didn't know it yet, but this ranch would challenge everything she thought she knew about the enemy. The lines between captor and captive were about to blur in ways she could never have imagined, because for the first time since the war began, she felt something dangerous. Not fear, not hate, but the faint, impossible whisper of hope.